The morning sun cast a golden glow over the royal palace, highlighting its grand walls and the neatly trimmed gardens that surrounded it. Tourists wandered through the gates, cameras clicking, their faces filled with awe. Among them walked a journalist named Mark, known for his daring stories and willingness to push boundaries. He had spent years chasing headlines, always hoping to capture moments that would make people talk. Today he had something particular in mind. Mark's eyes fell on the royal guard standing near the palace entrance. The guard was tall, rigid, and immaculately dressed in a dark uniform with shiny buttons and a crisp hat perched perfectly on his head. His posture was flawless, his face expressionless and his eyes forward, scanning the crowd with quiet alertness. To most people, he looked like an unmovable statue, a symbol of discipline and duty. But to Mark, he was the perfect target. Mark adjusted his camera, making sure the angle was right. He wanted to capture the guard's reaction on video, hoping that if he provoked him, the footage would go viral. He leaned slightly forward, muttering under his breath just loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Look at him, standing there like a robot. Can't even smile, poor guy," he said with a smirk, his voice carrying just a hint of challenge. The guard didn't move. He didn't even flinch. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, ignoring Mark entirely. The journalist's smirk widened. "Oh, this is going to be good," he thought. "I just need to push him a little more and he'll snap." Mark took a few steps closer, weaving through tourists who were too busy taking selfies to notice the brewing tension. He whispered sarcastically, "You really think you're important, don't you? All this uniform and hat, and yet you look so stiff. How long can you stand there like that without getting tired?" Still nothing changed. The guard's stance was unwavering, his expression calm. Mark's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. Normally people react. Normally people show emotion. But this guard, he was different. Mark's frustration began to grow, but he hid it behind a confident smile. He raised his voice slightly, just enough to draw attention from nearby tourists. "Hey, you! Yeah, you! Can't you even laugh? What kind of guard doesn't smile at the people?" His tone was playful, mocking, yet he expected a reaction, a crack in the armor. Some tourists began to notice, glancing at the journalist with curiosity. Phones were raised, capturing the interaction. Mark felt a surge of excitement. This was it. This was the moment that would make his story. But the guard didn't even look at him. His eyes remained fixed forward, his breathing steady and his body perfectly still. Mark's confidence wavered for a brief moment, replaced by impatience. He had faced tough people before, but none like this. There was a strange calmness about the guard, almost magnetic, almost intimidating in its serenity. Mark stepped closer, invading the invisible boundary that seemed to surround the guard. "You think you're untouchable, huh? Just standing there like some statue," he said, louder this time, trying to force a reaction. "People are watching you, you know. Don't they make you feel something? Don't they make you laugh at all?" The guard remained silent. His eyes flickered slightly, a small acknowledgement of the words, but still there was no anger, no irritation. Just patience, just presence. Mark felt a moment of doubt. Could it be that this man had trained himself so well that nothing could disturb him? Mark decided to try a different tactic. He leaned even closer and whispered, "You're not human, are you? You're a machine, a uniform without a soul." He smiled, thinking he was clever, expecting the guard to at least flinch, maybe even step back. But the guard's feet stayed firmly planted and his face remained unchanged. Mark's frustration now mingled with curiosity. He had always believed that if he pushed someone enough, they would reveal their true self. Yet here he was, standing in front of a man who seemed completely impervious. The crowd around them was growing slightly, some stopping to watch, sensing the unusual tension. People whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. For a moment, Mark felt a flicker of fear. What if the guard never reacted? What if the story he had come to create didn't exist? What if he had misjudged this man entirely? These thoughts rushed through his mind, but he quickly pushed them away. He was a journalist. He was trained to take risks. He would not back down. Mark straightened his posture and tried a new approach. "You must get tired of standing there all day, right? Don't you ever want to walk away, to talk to someone, to laugh?" His voice carried over the small crowd, and now several people were clearly watching. Some had their phones out, recording silently. Others were just staring, intrigued by the strange interaction. The guard's hands remained by his sides. His breathing was steady. His gaze was calm and unwavering. Mark felt an odd mix of irritation and admiration. This man was not only disciplined, but seemed to have an inner strength that Mark could not easily break. Mark decided to push once more. You think your uniform makes you important? It doesn't. People aren't impressed by standing still. They're impressed by action, by personality. What do you have? Nothing but a hat and a stiff stance. Now some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably. They sensed the journalist was being aggressive, but the guard still did not respond. Mark noticed a few murmurs in the crowd, people beginning to question the journalist's behavior. But he ignored them, focused only on the goal. He whispered again, directly into the guard's ear. You hide behind this uniform. You hide behind rules. But what's inside you? Do you even know who you are? Still, the guard remained calm. Still, he showed nothing. Mark's smirk faded, replaced by a strange sense of unease. This was not going as planned. He had expected a reaction, a flinch, a word, an expression. But this man, this guard, was unshakable. The journalist looked around at the crowd. Some were smiling politely, some were confused, and a few were beginning to shake their heads at him. Mark's mind raced. How could someone be so disciplined? How could someone remain so calm in the face of deliberate provocation? For a moment, Mark considered stopping. But that was not who he was. He was a journalist. He was bold. He would not walk away without a story. He straightened his shoulders and whispered once more, louder this time. You are not special. You are just standing there, pretending to matter. People see through you. The guard's posture did not change. His calm presence seemed to fill the space around him, almost like a silent wave that made the chaos around him feel smaller, less important. Mark could feel it. The journalist felt a strange weight, as if he was no longer in control. And then, just for a second, Mark saw it. A flicker in the guard's eyes. Not of anger, not of fear, but of awareness. The guard was fully present, fully conscious of the words, fully conscious of the crowd. And in that awareness, there was quiet strength. Mark took a step back, realizing something he had not expected. This was not just a uniform. This was a person who had trained himself, disciplined himself, and learned the power of silence. The journalist had intended to provoke, to humiliate, to create a viral story, but instead he was facing someone who could not be provoked. The crowd began to whisper, noticing the unusual dynamic. Phones continued to record, capturing the tension, capturing the stillness, capturing the unspoken lesson that was unfolding. Mark tried to regain his composure, but the energy in the air had shifted. This was no longer a game. As he looked at the guard, standing tall and calm, Mark felt a strange mix of frustration and respect. This man, so ordinary at first glance, had revealed something extraordinary. The journalist had come seeking a reaction, seeking conflict, seeking drama. But all he had found was dignity, patience, and an unshakable presence. Mark realized in that moment that the story he wanted might not be the story he would get. Perhaps the story was not about ridicule, but about restraint. Not about provocation, but about composure. Not about insult, but about quiet strength. And so, as the sun continued to rise over the palace gardens, the journalist lingered, uncertain of his next move, while the guard remained still as he always had, unshaken, unflinching, a silent reminder of the power of discipline and self-control. Mark stood a few feet away from the guard, shifting from one foot to the other, his excitement mingled with frustration. He had expected a reaction by now, a grimace, a scowl, even a twitch. But the guard, tall and unwavering, remained perfectly still, like a living statue. The calmness radiating from him was almost hypnotic. Mark had encountered difficult people before, but nothing like this. There was a quiet strength about the guard that seemed to demand attention without a single word. The crowd around them had grown. Tourists who had once been taking selfies now paused to watch the unusual encounter. Some whispered to one another, pointing at the journalist and the guard. Is he really bothering the guard? One woman asked, raising her phone. Another man shook his head, clearly disapproving of Mark's aggressive approach. Phones were out, silently recording the moment. People were naturally drawn to the tension, sensing that something significant was unfolding, even if they didn't know exactly what. The guard, for his part, remained perfectly composed. He had been trained for this, trained to stand for hours, to ignore distractions, to uphold dignity and honor no matter the circumstances. He had faced noisy crowds, unexpected movements, and even rude tourists before, but he had never been directly provoked in this way. He was aware of Mark, aware of the murmuring crowd, aware of the camera. Yet he remained calm. His eyes were alert, scanning the environment, but his body was still, his expression neutral. Mark, noticing the increasing attention from the crowd, decided to escalate his actions. He stepped closer, speaking louder this time, trying to draw even more attention. "You just stand there all day, don't you?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You never smile, never move, never talk. Aren't you tired of pretending to be important?" Still, the guard did not respond. His posture did not change. His calm, steady gaze gave nothing away. And that was when Mark realized something that made him uneasy. The guard's silence was not fear or weakness. It was confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from discipline and self-control. The kind that cannot be shaken by insults or mockery. Mark's mind raced. He had planned this confrontation carefully. He had imagined the perfect reaction, the moment the guard lost his composure, the viral video that would follow. But reality was different. The guard's unshakable calm had disrupted his plan. The journalist felt a strange mix of irritation and fascination. He wanted a reaction, yet the guard's presence commanded respect. A small group of onlookers began to whisper among themselves. "Look at him," one person said, pointing to the guard. "He doesn't even react." "That's amazing," another added. "I've never seen someone so calm. He's like a statue, but somehow powerful." The murmurs grew louder, and soon more people were watching. Some tourists who had not been paying attention before now turned their cameras toward the scene. Mark noticed the shift in energy and felt the pressure mounting. The journalist, who was used to controlling the narrative, realized that he no longer had control over the situation. The story he wanted to create was slipping away, replaced by something entirely different. He took a deep breath and tried a new approach. This time he lowered his voice slightly and leaned closer to the guard. "Don't you ever get bored?" he whispered, as if sharing a secret. "Don't you want to move, to laugh, to talk to someone?" The guard's eyes flickered slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of the question, but his body remained motionless. He did not turn, did not react, and did not speak. Mark felt a pang of frustration. He had expected conflict, drama, or at least a tiny sign of human emotion. Yet here he was, facing someone who seemed completely unshakable. Mark tried again, raising his voice slightly to address both the guard and the growing crowd. "People are watching you, you know. They're waiting for you to show something, anything. Don't they make you feel something?" Once again, the guard did not react. His calmness was more than just physical stillness. It was an invisible shield that made Mark feel increasingly uncomfortable. The journalist had thought he could control the situation, but the guard's presence was shifting the focus. The attention of the crowd was no longer on Mark's insults. It was on the guard's extraordinary composure. The journalist's frustration began to turn into curiosity. How could someone remain so disciplined, so patient, so unbothered by deliberate provocation? He had faced difficult people in his career, people who were angry, rude, or stubborn. But this was different. This was someone who seemed almost untouchable, a person whose strength lay in calmness rather than confrontation. Mark glanced at the crowd and saw expressions of admiration for the guard. Phones continued to record, capturing every moment. People whispered to each other, impressed by the guard's ability to maintain dignity in the face of provocation. Mark realized that the narrative he had hoped to create, him as the clever journalist exposing a stiff, unfeeling guard, was not unfolding as he had imagined. The guard's perspective was different. He had faced countless distractions in his career, and he understood that maintaining composure was a sign of strength. Reacting to every insult or challenge would only give power to the person provoking him. He knew that his silence was a form of control, and that his presence alone could command respect. He had trained his mind and body to remain steady, and today that training was proving invaluable. Mark, sensing the tension, tried a different tactic. He stepped closer, speaking directly into the guard's ear this time. "You think your uniform makes you special? You're nothing but a statue. People see through you." The guard's posture did not change. His eyes remained calm, his breathing steady. And in that moment, Mark realized that he had underestimated the guard entirely. This was not a man to be provoked. This was a man who had mastered himself, and his discipline shone brighter than any insult could diminish. The crowd continued to grow, more tourists stopping to watch the unusual encounter. Some whispered their admiration for the guard, noting the quiet strength in his stance. Others looked at Mark, questioning his behavior and the reason for his relentless provocation. The journalist felt the shift in energy and tried to regain control, but it was clear that the guard's composure was dominating the scene. Mark's mind raced. He had expected a story of conflict, of outrage, of viral drama. Instead, he was witnessing something far more compelling, a demonstration of patience, dignity, and self-control. The journalist's arrogance was being subtly exposed by the guard's calmness, and he felt a mix of frustration and respect. The guard's presence seemed to absorb the chaos around him. Tourists who had initially been focused on the journalist now found themselves captivated by the guard's quiet strength. The scene had transformed from a provocative confrontation to a lesson in composure. The guard's discipline and dignity spoke louder than any words, and the crowd could sense it. Mark realized that he had a choice. He could continue to push, to try to provoke a reaction that would never come, or he could step back and observe the power of restraint. He chose reluctantly to continue, driven by habit and his desire for a story. He leaned in once more, whispering, "You're hiding behind rules. Behind that uniform. But what are you really? Don't you ever want to break free?" The guard remained still, his eyes steady, his body unwavering, and in that moment Mark understood something profound. This man's strength did not come from aggression or confrontation. It came from discipline, self-awareness, and an unshakable commitment to his duty. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, phones continued to record, and Mark felt the pressure of being observed not just by the public, but by the undeniable presence of someone who could not be rattled. The journalist had set out to create a story of conflict, but he had instead stumbled upon a story of quiet strength and dignity. As the morning sun continued to rise, the guard remained in his position, a symbol of patience and control. Mark, now fully aware of the situation, felt a mixture of humility and frustration. The story he had hoped for was slipping away, replaced by a lesson in the power of self-discipline, and so the encounter continued, with Mark trying in vain to provoke, and the guard standing firm, calm, and composed. The crowd watched, fascinated, sensing that they were witnessing something rare and remarkable. The journalist had come seeking a reaction, but the guard's unwavering presence made it clear that true strength was not in responding to provocation, but in rising above it. Mark's frustration had grown steadily throughout the morning. He had tried everything: sarcasm, whispered insults, loud comments, but the guard remained completely unmoved. Each time Mark thought he might see even a small reaction, the guard's calmness and composure seemed to absorb it, leaving the journalist feeling smaller and less in control. The small crowd had grown considerably since Mark first approached the guard. Tourists, palace visitors, and even a few locals had gathered to witness the unusual scene. Many were holding phones, recording as if they sensed they were witnessing something special. Others whispered quietly among themselves, commenting on the journalist's behavior and the guard's incredible patience. Some shook their heads, clearly disapproving of Mark's relentless provocation. Mark glanced around at the growing crowd and felt a surge of anxiety. He had expected to dominate the scene, to draw attention to himself, to create a story where he could highlight the guard's rigidity or inability to respond. But reality was different. The attention had shifted away from him and toward the guard. Each whispered compliment about the guard's discipline, each recorded moment of his composure, felt like a tiny defeat to Mark's ego. Determined to regain control, Mark tried a new tactic. He decided to make his insults personal. Leaning closer, he said, "Don't you get lonely standing here all day? No friends, no conversation, just staring into space. Doesn't it get boring? Or are you too dull to enjoy life?" The guard didn't flinch. His posture remained perfect. His breathing was calm. His face revealed nothing. Mark's words seemed to fall into a wall of invisible patience, absorbed but not acknowledged. Mark's inner frustration grew, but he also began to notice something unexpected. Some of the onlookers were starting to shift in their perception. They were no longer just watching a confrontation. They were witnessing a lesson in composure. A few people whispered, "Wow, he's so calm. That takes real strength." Others nodded quietly, pointing out that the guard's silence was more powerful than any words could be. This shift was subtle but unmistakable. Mark realized with a pang of discomfort that he was no longer the center of attention. The story he had hoped to create, one where he mocked a rigid, humorless guard, was unraveling in front of him. Instead, he was now the one under scrutiny, his repeated attempts at provocation reflecting poorly in the eyes of the crowd. Refusing to accept defeat, Mark tried a louder approach. "People are watching you," he shouted. "Don't they make you feel anything? Don't you want to smile? To say something? To show that you're alive?" Still, the guard did not react. His composure seemed almost unbreakable. Even the smallest twitch of emotion, the slightest flinch was absent. And this, more than anything, began to frustrate Mark to the point of agitation. He had assumed that everyone had a breaking point, that everyone had a moment where they revealed their true selves under pressure. But this man, this guard, seemed to defy that assumption entirely. Mark's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He could escalate further, but the crowd's attention was now clearly turning against him. People were whispering, shaking their heads, and quietly recording his behavior. It was no longer a story of a journalist confronting a stoic guard. It was a lesson in humility, and Mark was the unintentional student. He leaned closer, almost nose to nose with the guard, and whispered, "You're hiding behind your uniform. Your pride, your rules. It's all fake. You're not special. You're just standing there pretending to matter." The guard remained calm. His eyes held a quiet awareness, not anger or fear, but a deep understanding of the situation. Mark could sense that the guard was fully present, aware of every word, every movement, every whisper of the crowd. Yet he did not respond. At that moment, a few people in the crowd began murmuring among themselves. "He's so disciplined," one woman whispered. "You can tell he's in control of himself." Another man added, "It's amazing that he doesn't even react." Most people would have snapped by now. The whispers grew louder, and more people joined in, quietly admiring the guard's patience. Mark noticed the change. The crowd's energy had shifted. Their attention, which he had hoped would focus on the guard's stiffness, was now drawn to the guard's extraordinary discipline. Their admiration for the guard's composure was undeniable. Mark realized that despite his efforts, he had lost the narrative. He had come to provoke, to expose, to dominate, but instead, the guard's silence was turning the crowd against him. Frustration burned within Mark, but it was accompanied by a strange sense of fascination. He could not understand how someone could remain so steady under provocation. He had thought himself clever, experienced, capable of drawing out reactions from anyone. But here he was, confronted by someone who seemed immune to his tactics. Mark's attempts to regain control became more desperate. He spoke louder, trying to capture the attention of the crowd once more. "Don't you want to do something?" he shouted. "Don't you want to show people that you're human? That you have feelings?" The guard did not respond. His stance remained perfect, his eyes calm and his breathing steady. The crowd's murmurs grew even louder, expressing admiration for his self-control. Mark began to feel a sense of isolation, as if the collective respect for the guard was highlighting his own lack of composure. At this point, the journalist realized something important. The story he had hoped to tell about a stiff, unfeeling guard was impossible to create. Every attempt at insult, every sarcastic remark, every whispered provocation was being absorbed by the guard's unwavering patience. Mark felt a creeping awareness that he had underestimated the situation entirely. The guard, meanwhile, continued to focus on his duty. He had trained for moments like this to maintain composure, to uphold dignity, and to resist provocation. His silence was not a sign of weakness, but of mastery. He knew that any reaction would give power to the person attempting to provoke him. By remaining calm, he had already won the encounter, though few would understand that yet. The crowd was now fully aware of the dynamic. People whispered, recorded, and even smiled quietly, impressed by the guard's discipline. Mark's attempts to provoke had inadvertently highlighted the guard's strength. The journalist, usually in control of narratives, was now being subtly outshone by the man he had come to mock. Mark's frustration reached a peak. He had expected drama, conflict, and chaos, but instead he was facing a man whose calmness rendered all provocation powerless. He realized that his own behavior, loud and desperate, was starting to reflect poorly on him. The crowd, sensing the imbalance, began to view him as the aggressor, while the guard remained a figure of quiet respect. Desperation pushed Mark to try one final tactic. He leaned even closer, speaking in a voice both sharp and provocative. "You're not as strong as you think. You're hiding behind a uniform and rules. People can see right through you." For a moment, the guard's eyes seemed to glimmer with awareness. Not anger, not fear. just awareness. He understood Mark's intentions fully, yet he remained silent. His composure was complete, unbroken by words or gestures. At that instant, Mark noticed the collective gaze of the crowd. People were watching intently, some with admiration, some with quiet disapproval. The journalist, once confident, now felt the weight of being observed, not as a clever provocateur, but as someone failing to understand true strength. The guard's presence was magnetic, absorbing the energy around him. Mark's aggressive words seemed to fade in comparison to the power of calmness and self-control. The crowd was witnessing something rare, a demonstration of patience and dignity that contrasted sharply with the journalist's frantic energy. Mark finally stepped back. Exhausted, his planned story slipping further from his grasp, the guard continued to stand perfectly still. As if nothing had happened, yet in reality, he had turned the entire encounter into a silent lesson in composure and respect. By the end of the morning, the journalist understood that the story he had hoped to capture, one of mockery or drama, was no longer possible. Instead, he was learning in real time a lesson about the power of patience, discipline, and quiet strength. The guard's unwavering calm had subtly turned the situation around, and the crowd had noticed every moment of it. Mark's frustration and fascination mixed together, creating a sense of introspection. He had thought himself clever, experienced, and in control, but here he was, humbled by a man whose strength lay not in reaction, but in restraint. The journalist realized that the encounter was no longer about creating a story. It was about witnessing something remarkable. And so, as the morning sun climbed higher, the guard continued his duty, standing tall, calm, and composed, while Mark reluctantly began to understand that true strength often comes not from confrontation, but from the ability to remain unshaken. The crowd watched, mesmerized, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A quiet demonstration of dignity, patience, and control that would stay in their minds long after the encounter ended. Mark's frustration had reached its peak. He had shouted, whispered, and tried every trick he knew to provoke the guard, yet the man had remained completely calm. Each attempt to disrupt him had failed, and now the crowd's attention was no longer on Mark's provocations. It was entirely on the guard's unshakable composure. The journalist felt a mix of irritation and disbelief. He had expected a reaction, a hint of weakness, something that would allow him to control the narrative and capture the perfect story. But now, standing before him was a man who seemed almost untouchable. Mark glanced around, noticing how the crowd had shifted subtly. The murmurs of admiration for the guard's patience were growing louder. People were recording with their phones, capturing every moment of the quiet standoff. Some were smiling. Others were shaking their heads in subtle disapproval of Mark's behavior. The energy in the air was different from anything Mark had anticipated. For a moment, Mark considered leaving, admitting defeat silently to himself. But his pride and the years he had spent building a reputation for bold reporting would not allow it. He took a deep breath and prepared for another attempt, fully expecting that if he pushed hard enough, the guard would finally respond. But then, something unexpected happened. The guard, who had been silent for so long, spoke, not with anger, not with frustration, but in a calm, steady voice that carried clearly to the crowd. "Sir," he began, addressing Mark directly, "I am here to serve my duty. I understand that you are trying to provoke a reaction, but my role is not to respond to insult or mockery. My purpose is to uphold respect, discipline, and order." The crowd went quiet, mesmerized by the guard's words. They were simple yet powerful, and delivered with a calm authority that drew every ear toward him. Mark, momentarily stunned, opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The journalist realized for the first time that he had underestimated the guard completely. The guard continued, his voice steady and clear, yet filled with a quiet wisdom. Many people seek attention through conflict, through provocation. But true strength does not come from reacting to every insult. True strength comes from control, patience, and understanding. It is not about proving others wrong. It is about knowing yourself and maintaining your dignity in every situation. The tourists and onlookers listened intently. Some whispered to each other, clearly impressed by the guard's ability to remain composed while speaking. Phones continued to record, but now the focus was not on Mark, but on the guard and the lesson he was teaching without even raising his voice. Mark's mind raced. He had come prepared to create a viral moment, but he was now the one being observed. quietly evaluated by the crowd. The guard's words, simple and measured, exposed something that Mark had not expected: the journalist's arrogance, his insistence on control, and his failure to understand that not all power is visible. The guard continued, addressing the crowd more broadly now. It is easy to judge others, to make assumptions based on appearances or roles. But every person has their own strengths, their own discipline, and their own experiences that guide their actions. Respect is earned not by provoking, but by understanding and observing the value of others. People in the crowd nodded, murmuring quietly to one another. Some raised their phones higher to record the moment, sensing that they were witnessing a rare display of dignity and composure. Others looked at Mark, their expressions subtly critical. The journalist, who had intended to provoke admiration for his own cleverness, now felt the weight of the crowd's judgment. Mark tried to regain control, attempting to speak, but the words faltered on his lips. The guard's calm, articulate explanation left little room for argument. His presence was strong, but his approach was gentle, almost philosophical. It was clear that he had not only resisted provocation, but had turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate the power of patience and dignity. The guard paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He looked directly at Mark, yet his gaze was not threatening. It was steady, compassionate even, as if he were speaking not to humiliate but to teach. It is human to seek recognition, to desire attention, and to want to influence others, he said. But the way we seek that attention defines us. Acting with respect, patience, and understanding is far more powerful than creating conflict or humiliation. Every action carries a message, and every choice reflects who we are. The crowd reacted with quiet applause, subtle yet sincere. Mark, standing there, could feel a mix of emotions: shame, frustration, and a reluctant admiration. He realized that the story he had hoped to create had been inverted. The narrative was no longer about a journalist exposing a stiff guard. It was about a man who had turned provocation into a lesson on dignity, patience, and respect. Some people in the crowd approached the journalist cautiously, shaking their heads or offering quiet comments. "He's incredible," one whispered. "I've never seen anyone stay so calm under pressure." Another added, "You came here to provoke, but he's shown everyone the true meaning of strength." Mark's pride bristled at first, but deep down he knew they were right. The guard's response had done something he could not undo. It had exposed his arrogance and reminded him that true power is often quiet, not loud or confrontational. The guard continued, addressing Mark directly once more. "Your intent may have been to create conflict, to seek attention, or to entertain. But I encourage you to reflect on the lessons this moment offers. Patience, discipline, and respect are often invisible qualities, yet they hold more weight than any outward display of provocation or cleverness." The journalist finally found his voice, but it was quieter than before. He could feel the weight of the guard's words pressing on him. He realized that he had not only failed to provoke the guard, but had also revealed his own shortcomings to the public. The lesson was clear. Arrogance and provocation may attract attention, but they do not earn respect. The crowd, sensing the conclusion of the encounter, began to disperse slowly. Some people stopped to shake the guard's hand or nod respectfully, quietly acknowledging the dignity and composure he had demonstrated. Others approached Mark cautiously, offering advice or subtle criticism, reminding him that not every story could be shaped by aggression or clever provocation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the guard resumed his duties. He stood tall, calm, and composed, returning to his position with the same dignity he had maintained throughout the encounter. The crowd continued to watch briefly, then slowly drifted away, carrying with them a memory of a rare moment, a lesson in patience, self-control, and quiet strength. Mark, meanwhile, lingered for a moment, reflecting on what had happened. He realized that the true story of the morning was not about provocation or viral moments, but about the guard's ability to remain composed under pressure. He understood finally that the lessons of dignity and patience were far more compelling than any moment of conflict he could have manufactured. The journalist took a deep breath and stepped back, humbled. He had set out to create a story that would capture attention through provocation, but instead, he had learned an important lesson about respect, discipline, and the true nature of strength. The guard had not only maintained composure, but had used the moment to quietly teach those around him, turning what could have been a negative encounter into a memorable demonstration of patience and dignity. As Mark walked away, he could feel the weight of the experience settling in. The crowd's subtle reactions, the guard's calm presence, and the realization of his own arrogance left him introspective. He knew that this encounter would stay with him, not as a story of provocation, but as a lesson in humility and the power of quiet strength. The morning ended with a sense of calm, the palace gardens bathed in sunlight, and the guard returning to his duties with the same unwavering composure. Mark, meanwhile, reflected on the morning's events, aware that he had witnessed something rare, a living example of patience, discipline, and dignity that spoke louder than any words or provocation ever could. The day had grown warmer, and the palace gardens were now filled with a gentle golden light. Tourists meandered through the paths, some pausing to admire the grand architecture, others chatting quietly, their cameras capturing moments of beauty. In the midst of this calm, Mark walked slowly away from the royal guard, his mind heavy with reflection. The confrontation, which he had intended to be the centerpiece of his next story, had not gone as planned. Mark had approached the guard expecting a reaction, anger, irritation, even a sarcastic retort. But what he found instead was quiet strength, composure, and dignity. Every insult he had thrown had been absorbed with patience. Every attempt at provocation had been met with calm, unwavering silence. And when the guard had finally spoken, his words had been so measured, so insightful, that they left Mark questioning not only his own actions, but the way he had always approached his work. As Mark walked, he noticed the subtle reactions of the crowd around him. Some tourists were discussing the encounter in hushed tones, clearly impressed by the guard's ability to maintain his composure. "That was incredible," one woman whispered to her friend. "I've never seen anyone so calm and disciplined under pressure." Another man nodded in agreement. He didn't even raise his voice, he just stood there calm and confident. That takes real strength. Mark realized that the narrative he had intended to create had been completely inverted. He had hoped to highlight the guard's rigidity, to mock what he assumed was stiffness or dullness. Instead, the story had been about the guard's extraordinary patience, the subtle power of composure, and the quiet impact of dignity. The crowd's admiration had shifted from him to the guard, and for the first time, Mark felt the weight of humility pressing upon him. The journalist reflected on the guard's words, which had resonated far beyond the immediate encounter. "True strength does not come from reacting to every insult," the guard had said. "True strength comes from control, patience, and understanding. It is not about proving others wrong. It is about knowing yourself and maintaining your dignity in every situation." These words lingered in Mark's mind, a quiet echo that challenged his long-held assumptions about attention, power, and influence. Mark paused near a fountain, watching the water ripple gently in the sunlight. He thought about his career, the countless stories he had pursued, often seeking sensational moments, conflicts, and dramatic reactions. He realized that in many of those situations he had overlooked the quiet power of patience and dignity. He had believed that provocation and cleverness were the keys to influence, but now he saw that restraint and composure often held far more weight. As he continued to reflect, Mark noticed that some members of the crowd were quietly approaching the guard, offering polite nods or words of respect. The guard acknowledged them with the same calm, steady demeanor that had characterized the entire morning. There was no arrogance, no pride, just a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. The sight of this humility in action further emphasized the lesson Mark had learned. The journalist could feel the contrast between himself and the guard more acutely than ever. While the guard had turned provocation into a demonstration of wisdom, Mark had allowed his ego to drive his actions, seeking attention at the expense of respect. The lesson was clear. Outward showiness and confrontation might attract eyes, but they did not earn genuine admiration or respect. True strength was silent, steady, and disciplined. Mark thought about the viral potential of the encounter. In another situation, he might have been pleased to capture a dramatic reaction on video, something sensational that would garner views and clicks. But now he realized that the most compelling moment had already been captured, not by his provocation, but by the guard's calm presence and insightful words. The crowd's respect and admiration were far more powerful than any viral moment he could manufacture. The guard, meanwhile, continued his duties with unwavering composure. He returned to his post, scanning the area with the same alertness and calm as before. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like nothing had changed, but those who had witnessed the confrontation understood the quiet significance of the morning. The guard had demonstrated the power of restraint, the value of discipline, and the importance of dignity in the face of provocation. Mark, walking away from the scene, reflected on what he had learned. The encounter had exposed not only the guard's extraordinary patience but also his own tendencies toward arrogance and provocation. He realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons are not learned through confrontation, but through observation. By witnessing the guard's quiet strength, he had gained a deeper understanding of respect, patience, and the subtle power of calmness. The journalist thought about how he might share this story in the future. It would no longer be about provocation or conflict, but about the unexpected lesson he had learned from the guard. He imagined describing the scene: the crowd gathering, the tension in the air, his attempts to provoke, and the guard's measured, wise response. The story would highlight not his cleverness, but the guard's patience and dignity, a lesson for anyone who sought influence through attention rather than integrity. Mark paused again, watching the tourists disperse, their cameras still recording, their faces reflecting curiosity and admiration. He realized that the true impact of the morning would extend far beyond the immediate encounter. People who witnessed the guard's composure would carry the lesson with them, perhaps reflecting on their own behavior in moments of challenge or provocation. The guard had demonstrated that strength was not loud or aggressive, but calm, disciplined, and thoughtful. The journalist felt a subtle shift within himself. He understood that he had been humbled, not humiliated, and that humility was a powerful teacher. For the first time in a long time, he recognized the limits of provocation and the value of observing true strength when it presented itself. The morning had shown him that dignity, patience, and composure were qualities that could leave a lasting impression far beyond any clever remark or viral stunt. As the sun reached its highest point, casting a warm glow over the palace gardens, Mark finally allowed himself to let go of the tension and frustration he had carried throughout the encounter. He understood that the story he had been seeking was already unfolding in front of him, not through conflict, but through the guard's extraordinary ability to remain calm, composed, and dignified. The crowd began to drift away, many smiling quietly, some nodding respectfully to the guard, and a few even approaching him briefly to offer words of admiration. The guard acknowledged each gesture with the same steady composure, reinforcing the quiet lesson he had imparted without ever raising his voice or showing anger. Mark took one last look at the guard before turning away. He knew that this moment would remain with him for a long time, a reminder that true influence is not earned through provocation, but through restraint, integrity, and patience. The lesson was simple yet profound. Strength is not about forcing reactions, but about maintaining dignity in every situation. As he walked through the palace gardens, Mark reflected on how he might apply this lesson in his own life. He realized that in his pursuit of stories and attention, he had often overlooked the quiet power of patience and humility. The guard had shown him that true respect is earned not by confrontation, but by demonstrating discipline, composure, and understanding. By the end of the morning, the palace returned to its usual rhythm. Tourists continued to explore, guards maintained their posts, and the gardens remained calm and orderly. But for those who had witnessed the encounter, especially Mark, the morning had left an indelible impression. It had been a lesson in humility, patience, and the subtle, yet profound, impact of dignity and self-control. Mark finally allowed himself to smile faintly, a mixture of relief and newfound respect filling him. He had come seeking a story, but he had left with something far more valuable, an understanding of what true strength looks like, and a lesson in humility that would guide him in moments far beyond the palace gates. As the guard stood silently at his post, scanning the crowd with the same alertness and calm as always, Mark knew one thing with certainty. This man had not only performed his duty flawlessly, but had also demonstrated a quiet, lasting power that would remain with everyone who had witnessed it. The journalist had learned, perhaps more profoundly than he expected, that sometimes the most remarkable stories are not created, they are observed. The morning ended with a sense of calm and reflection. Mark walked away, thoughtful and introspective, while the guard continued his watch, a living example of dignity, patience, and quiet strength. The encounter, once filled with tension and anticipation, had transformed into a lesson that would linger long after the crowds had dispersed. A reminder that true strength is revealed not through reaction, but through composure, discipline, and unwavering respect.